So for this lesson, we're going to be rounding to nearest tens or hundreds with a number line. So a concept that we need to understand before we get started are whole tens, because whole tens are the numbers we're going to be rounding to. So we need to first identify and understand what they are. So our whole tens are going to be our tens, our 20s, our 30s, our 40s, 50s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 80s, 90s, and 100. So those are our whole tens for when we're rounding. We also need to understand place value. So in order to understand how we round, we need to first identify the place value positions of these numbers. So our example is going to be 146. So what we're going to do is we're going to see where those numbers fall in this little chart or this little graph. So the 6 is actually going to fall in the ones place. So that's where it's going to be. Our 4 is going to be in our tens, and our 1 is going to be in our hundreds, and that comes into play a little bit later. So our rules for rounding. So it's a very simple way to understand how we round is going to be 5 or more. We're going to let it soar, but we're also, while we're doing that, we're going to be looking at our place value. So we're going to be looking at our numbers that are in our ones and in the tens place. So another rule we need to understand is 4 or less, we're going to let it rest. And we're only going to be looking at our ones place for that. We don't need to go into our tens. So let's go over kind of like a few examples. So what numbers are we looking at when we're rounding? So our example or our number we're looking at is going to be 14. So we're only going to be looking at the 4 in this case. Because the number is 4 or less, we're just going to let it rest. And a number that we're going to round that to is actually going to be 10, because we're going to keep in mind our whole tens. Since it is 4 or less, we're going to let it rest, and we're going to let it rest on down to our whole 10 that it is appropriate to, which is going to be 10. This number, we're going to be looking at the 5. Now, for 5 or more, we're going to let it soar. So we're letting it soar on over to our, from our 5 to our 2. So 5 or more, we're letting it soar, and we're actually going to be letting it soar on over to the nearest whole 10, which is going to be 130. So that 5 brings the 2 to a 3. Increasing it. So for this one, we're going to be looking at our ones place, but since it's 5 or more, we're letting it soar on over to the 6. And the most appropriate whole 10 for that is going to be 170. So we're letting it soar on over to that whole 10 of 170. Here are a few more examples. For 5 or more, let it soar. 4 or less, let it rest. So we're going to be looking at the 4. We're going to be letting it rest. So we're going to be rounding on it down to the nearest whole 10 of 50. This is going to be 5 or more. So we're going to let it soar on over to our next whole 10 of 60. 4 or less again with 62. We're going to round it on down to our whole 10 of 60. 4 or less, 71. We're going to be rounding on down to the whole 10 of 70. Here are a few more examples for rounding. So these are going to be bigger numbers. So again, 4 or less, we're going to let it rest. So our whole 10, that 104 is in between, is going to be 100 or 110. But because the number is 5 or 4 or less, we're letting it rest on down to 100.